Susanna woke the way she always woke, in the black hour before the sky knew what it meant to be blue, with the sound of the sea coming through the window like a long breath let out and drawn in again. She lay still a moment beneath the quilt her mother had pieced from flour sacking and worn calico, feeling the cold press of the room against her nose and cheeks, the rest of her warm in the nest she had made overnight. The mattress ticking rustled under her when she shifted, a dry papery whisper of corn husks settling. Somewhere below, through the floorboards, she heard her father's boots on the kitchen stones, unhurried, and the small metal clink of the damper being opened on the stove. She did not need the little tin clock on the shelf to tell her the hour. Her body had learned the lighthouse's rhythm the way it had learned to walk so long ago that she could not remember not knowing it. 4 o'clock, or near enough. The light must be out and the lens curtained before the sun came far enough over the water to do it harm. And on a clear morning like this one promised to be, the sun would come quickly, without a cloud to slow it. She rose, and the floor was cold through her stockinged feet, the boards taking the chill of the night and holding it, as they always did in this house of stone and plaster that never seemed to grow properly warm until July. She dressed in the dark, from habit and to save the oil, pulling her gray wool dress over her shift, working the buttons up the front by feel, her fingers quick and sure from 3 years of practice. She could dress herself in the dark faster than her younger brother George could dress himself in full daylight with someone standing over him, and she took a small private pride in this, the kind of pride nobody else would understand or need to. Down in the kitchen, her mother was already at the stove, coaxing the fire up from its banked coals, feeding it splinters of driftwood that caught with a small orange flare and a smell like the inside of an old ship. The kitchen smelled, as it always did at this hour, of the ash and iron of the stove, of yesterday's bread going a little stale in its cloth, of the salt that seemed to live in every seam of the house, no matter how often the floors were scrubbed. Her mother did not turn from the stove, but said good morning in the low voice she kept for these early hours, as though the dark itself might overhear and take offense at anything louder. "Your father's gone up already," her mother said. "Take him his coffee when it's boiled. Mind the pot. It wants to catch this morning. The wood's too dry." Susanna nodded, though her mother could not have seen the nod with her back turned, and went to the window instead, drawing the curtain aside an inch with one finger. The sky beyond the glass was the color of a mussel shell, dark blue-black at the top of the pane and softening degree by degree toward the horizon, where a thin band of paleness had begun to show, not yet pink, not yet anything you could put a name to. The sea beneath it lay flat and quiet, the kind of stillness it wore perhaps one morning in 5, when the wind forgot itself entirely and the water turned to something like hammered pewter, taking the sky's first light and giving it back in long, unbroken sheets. She could hear it from here, the same unhurried breathing sound, the small hiss and draw of it over the rocks below the point, patient as a sleeping animal. She loved this hour best of all the hours in her day, though she could not have said precisely why, except that it belonged to her and to her father, and to no one else, not truly even to her mother, who kept to the house at this time and left the tower to the two of them as she had for as long as Susanna could remember. The coffee came to a boil with a small, violent sputtering, and Susanna lifted the pot from the stove with a folded cloth, filling her father's tin cup 2/3 full and no more, the way he liked it, so he might carry it up the tower stairs without slopping it on the risers. She wrapped her shawl over her shoulders, opened the door that connected the dwelling to the base of the tower, and stepped into the covered passage, a low brick corridor her father called simply the covered way, built so no one need cross the open yard in weather to reach the light. This morning there was no weather to speak of, only the cool, damp air off the water and the smell of it, that particular smell of low tide and wet stone and the sweetish rot of eel grass that she had breathed every morning of her life and had long since stopped noticing as a smell at all, except on the rare days when she was away from it and came home again, and it struck her fresh, like a greeting. At the base of the tower she began to climb. The stairs wound upward in a tight iron spiral, painted white below and worn to bare metal on the treads, where 3 generations of keepers' boots had scoured the paint away, a thin dark ribbon spiraling up through the white like a seam of ore. Her hand found the rail without her needing to look at it. Cool iron, faintly gritty with salt, that crept in no matter how often it was wiped down. She counted the turns without meaning to count them, the way a person's feet know a staircase in their own house. 102 steps from the passage floor to the watchroom, and she had known that number since she was 9 years old and had first been allowed to climb it alone. Halfway up, she paused where the small, deep-set window let in its little disk of graying light and looked out at the water again, closer now, more of it visible, the calm sheet of it running out to where the sky met the sea in a line so soft this morning that she could not have said exactly where one ended and the other began. Not a white cap on it, not a smudge of weather anywhere in that whole wide bowl of sky. It would be a fair day, the kind her father called a gift day, when there was nothing for the keeper to do but the plain good work of keeping, without a single worry riding along beside it. She climbed on, up into the lantern room, and found her father already there, as she had known she would, standing at the great brass lamp with his hands moving over it in the small economical motions of a man who had done a thing 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more before he was through. He was a tall man gone gray early, with a face weathered the color of the tower's own granite base, and he wore his oilcloth apron over his shirt even now, in fair weather, from habit, the way another man might wear his spectacles, though his eyes had long since learned the shape of everything around him. "There she is," he said, not turning, meaning either his daughter or the coming dawn, and Susanna was never entirely sure which, and rather liked that she was never sure. She set the coffee on the small shelf built for the purpose out of the way of the works, and came to stand beside him at the lamp. The wick still burned, small and steady, the flame no bigger than the last joint of her thumb, throwing its light up through the tiers of prisms that ringed the lens like ice caught in the shape of a beehive, catching and bending and flinging the light outward through the glazing into the thinning dark. Beyond the panes, she could just make out, very far off, the low black shape of a schooner's sail, no more than a smudge against the water, making its way south with the last of the night behind it, following the light home the way ships had always done, the way they would go on doing long after she herself was an old woman. "Time," her father said, and Susanna reached up with him, and together, as they had done 1,000 mornings before this one, they turned down the wick until the small flame guttered, wavered, and went dark, leaving only the gray hush of early morning and the enormous cold eye of the lens looking out at nothing. Now came the part of the morning that belonged to care rather than to watching. Her father set down his empty cup and reached for the heavy linen curtains folded on their shelf. Thick, cream-colored panels hemmed with a weighted cord along the bottom, and Susanna took up her side without being asked. The two of them working in the easy, wordless coordination of people who had performed the same small ceremony together more mornings than either could count. The curtains hung on a track that circled the lens on the outside of the glazing, and drawing them was a slow business, hand over hand, easing the heavy cloth around the curve of the lantern-room glass, so that by the time the sun climbed high enough to strike it full on, not one ray of direct light would fall upon the great lens within. Her father had told her once, when she was small enough to need telling, that the sun through all those prisms magnified and gathered the way the lens gathered a lamp's small flame into a beam that could be seen 20 miles out, could scorch and craze glass never meant to bear such heat, could even, if neglected long enough, set fire to the very curtains meant to guard it. Her father had said it plainly, in the same even voice he used for everything, the way a man says a pot must not be left dry on the fire or bread will burn if you forget it. And so she had come to think of the curtaining not as guarding against anything at all, but simply as one more task in the day's plain order, no more remarkable than shutting a cellar door. With the lens shrouded and the room gone dim and soft, lit now only by the gray daylight seeping around the curtain's edges, her father lit the small hand lamp they kept for close work, and the two of them began the cleaning. This was the work Susanna loved best of anything in the tower, more even than the watching, though she would not have said so aloud, not wanting to seem to slight her father's long nights. She took down the soft chamois cloths from their peg and the small tin of rouge powder, a fine red compound no coarser than flour, and began at the lowest tier of prisms, working her way around the great bronze frame with patient, circling strokes. Each prism had to be wiped first of the night's soot, the faint gray film left by hours of burning oil, then polished with the rouge until the glass gave back the lamplight sharp and clean, without haze, without a single smear to blur the beam that would leave this room tonight and carry 20 miles over open water. She worked with her sleeves pinned back and her hair tied close beneath a kerchief, for the polishing raised a fine reddish dust that found its way into everything, hair and eyebrows, and the creases of one's knuckles. And she had learned long ago not to wear her good dresses on cleaning mornings. The lens itself was a marvelous thing to be this close to, this early, with the world outside still gray and hushed. It rose taller than her father, ring upon ring of glass prisms set in their bronze framework like the layered petals of some enormous crystal flower, each prism cut and ground to bend the lamp's small light exactly so, gathering what would otherwise scatter uselessly into the sky and bending it instead into a single powerful beam, low and level, aimed out across the water where it belonged. She had read once, in a pamphlet her father kept in the watchroom, that a Frenchman named Fresnel had worked out the mathematics of it, and she liked to think of him, some foreign gentleman of another century, bent over his figures by candlelight, working out how glass might be persuaded to do what a plain mirror never could. She liked equally to think that she, Susanna Teal of Cormorant Point understood the workings of that same glass well enough to clean it properly, prism by prism, without her father needing to check her work, which he had not done, she was fairly certain, in above a year. While she polished the lens, her father saw to the lamp itself, drawing the wick assembly free of its font and turning it in his hands, examining the char along its edge with the particular attention he gave to nothing else in his life so completely. He trimmed the wick with the small curved scissors kept for the purpose, shaving away the charred cotton in a fine even line, for a wick trimmed crookedly would burn crookedly, throwing more light to one side than the other, and a keeper who let his flame burn unevenly for want of 5 minutes' care was not, in her father's estimation, much of a keeper at all. He held the trimmed wick up to the gray light from the curtain's edge and turned it, satisfied, then set about filling the reservoir with mineral oil carried up in a covered can from the oil house that stood apart from the dwelling, a small brick building kept locked and separate as the regulations required, so that no stray spark from stove or hearth might ever reach the great store of kerosene that fed the light through its long nights. Susanna finished the last tier of prisms and stood back to look at her work, turning her head slowly to catch the lamp's small flame, reflected clean and sharp, and multiplied 100-fold in the polished glass. No smear, no haze, nothing to rob the beam of even a fraction of its reach. Satisfied, she turned to the brasswork next, the great pedestal on which the lens turned, the clockwork housing, the rails and fittings, all of it gone soft and dull overnight, with the faint tarnish that salt air pressed onto brass the way frost pressed itself onto a window pane. She took up a fresh cloth and the tin of polish and began to work, small circles, steady pressure, until beneath her hands the dull greenish cast gave way to a warm burnished gold that caught what little light there was and threw it back, doubled. Her arm had long ago grown accustomed to this labor and did not tire of it the way it once had when she was younger and smaller, and the whole enormous fitted machinery of the light had seemed a mountain she was set to polish with a teaspoon. Her father, meanwhile, had gone to the clockwork mechanism in its case at the center of the room, the great weight-driven works that turned the lens through its slow, patient revolutions all through the night, so that the light did not simply glow but flashed on and off, in the particular rhythm that told a sailor far out on the water exactly which light he was looking at, and therefore exactly where he stood upon the chart. He wound the weights back up to the top of their long descent, the crank turning under his hand with a low ratcheting creak, drawing the iron weight back up through its tube that ran down through the very heart of the tower to the base, ready to begin its slow, patient fall again once the mechanism was set running come evening. He checked the oil in the works, wiped a fleck of grit from a gear tooth with the corner of his thumb, and made a small, satisfied sound in his throat, the sound he made when a thing was as it ought to be, and required nothing further of him. By the time the brass shone to Susanna's satisfaction, and her father had finished with the works, the light outside the curtained glass had grown from gray to something with the faint beginning of color in it, a paleness that was not yet gold, but promised gold soon. They went together to the outer gallery, stepping out through the small door onto the iron walk that circled the lantern room, and here at last Susanna let herself simply stand a moment and look, her polishing cloth still in her hand, forgotten. The sea spread out below and around them in every direction but the one where the mainland lay, gray-blue now, calm as a mill pond, clear to the horizon, not a ripple of wind disturbing it, not a cloud anywhere in that whole pale bowl of morning sky. Gulls wheeled below the gallery rail, indifferent to the height, crying their thin, flat cries, and far off she could see the schooner she had glimpsed earlier, hull down now, only its topsail still catching the first real light of the day, gold where the rest of the world was still silver. The air up here always tasted faintly of salt and cold iron, and this morning it carried besides the green smell of the mainland waking somewhere beyond the point, cut grass and wood smoke drifting thin across the water. She breathed it in, the whole enormous stillness of it, and thought, as she thought most fair mornings, that she would not trade this small gray tower and its endless careful chores for any house in any city in the world. "Breakfast," her father said behind her, not unkindly, breaking the spell, and she turned from the rail and followed him back in through the narrow door, down the long spiral stair, counting the turns again without meaning to, back toward the smell of her mother's kitchen and the morning's next round of work. Breakfast was porridge, and the last of the stale bread toasted hard over the stove's open door, with a scrape of butter from the crock they kept cool in the cellar, and a dish of stewed apples her mother had put up the autumn before, sweet and a little dark with cinnamon bark, that had come on the tender's last visit. George was awake now, 10 years old and always hungry, sitting at the table with his hair standing up in a cowlick no comb had ever quite subdued, spooning porridge with the single-minded devotion he brought to all his meals. He was full of talk this morning, as he was most mornings, about a crab he had found the day before wedged in the rocks below the boathouse, and whether it might be the same crab he had found the week before, a question he seemed to consider of real importance. It hadn't the same claw, Susanna told him, buttering her toast. The one last week had a chip out of the left claw. This one you're telling me about, you said nothing of a chip. "I might have missed it," George said, wounded. "You never miss anything about a crab, George Teal. You know a crab's claw better than you know your own catechism." Her mother, setting the coffee pot back on the stove, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but stood in for one, and even her father, come down now from the tower with the smell of brass polish still faintly on his hands, allowed the corner of his mouth to lift. It was a small kitchen, low-beamed, warmed at last by the stove's steady heat, and Susanna thought, not for the first time, that there was something in a family taking its breakfast together in a room 3 feet from where the sea itself murmured against the rocks that made the plainest porridge taste like a kind of grace. Her father ate quickly, as he always did, a keeper's habit. For even on a gift day like this one, there was the logbook waiting, and after that the long list of the day's ordinary labors, and he did not care to let his coffee cool while he lingered over talk of crabs. He rose, thanked her mother with a nod that had long since taken the place of words between them, and went to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen where the station's log lay open, its pages ruled in narrow columns, and Susanna watched him dip his pen and begin the morning's entry in his neat, unhurried hand. Wind, calm, weather, clear, sea, smooth, lamp extinguished 4:52, lens curtained, cleaning performed. She had watched him write nearly identical words on nearly identical mornings for as long as she could read over his shoulder, and there was a comfort in the sameness of it, the way the log itself seemed a kind of long, patient poem about nothing happening day after day after day, which was, she had come to understand the whole aim and purpose of a keeper's life, a light that burned every night without fail, and a log that recorded over and over that nothing whatever had gone wrong. "Inspector might come this month," he said, not looking up from the page. "Judkins at the fish weir told the milk boy the tender's been sighted working this stretch of coast." "The brass is done," Susanna said, "and the lens." "I know it," her father said. "I watched you do it." He said it plainly, but she felt the small warmth of the praise anyway, the way she always did, for her father was not a man who scattered his compliments about like chicken feed, and the ones he gave landed with weight for being rare. An inspector's visit, when it came without warning, the Lighthouse tender simply appearing one morning against the horizon and putting a boat ashore, and a gentleman in a dark coat climbing the tower stairs to run a white-gloved finger along the ledges and sills, testing for dust where dust had no business being. Susanna had never yet seen her father found wanting, not in the 4 years she had been old enough to understand what the inspections meant, and she did not expect to see it now. But the possibility of the tender's white hull rounding the point kept a certain crispness in the household's habits that never quite relaxed, gift day or no gift day. Breakfast finished, the morning's chores began in earnest, and these were chores that belonged to the house and the yard rather than the tower, and so belonged more properly to Susanna and her mother than to her father, who had already gone back out to see to the oil house and the boat house and the small covered shed where the station supply of coal was kept dry against the winter. Susanna cleared the table while her mother scoured the porridge pot with sand and a twist of rag, and then the two of them went out together into the low gold light of full morning, baskets over their arms, to see to the garden and the hens. The garden lay on the sheltered side of the dwelling, behind a stone wall. Susanna's father and the assistant keeper, Mr. Doyle, had built together the summer she turned 12. A low wall meant less to keep anything out than to break the worst of the salt wind and give the vegetables a fighting chance. It was a poor, thin soil for growing, sandy and quick to dry, and her mother had spent years coaxing it into bearing what it bore, hauling seaweed up from the shore each spring to dig in for the good it did the ground, and now in high summer the wall's shelter held a modest but real abundance, rows of bush beans heavy with pods, a stand of potatoes going yellow-green and healthy at the top, a patch of carrots. Susanna had thinned herself not a fortnight before, and along the wall's warmest stretch a tangle of squash vines with their great rough leaves and yellow trumpet flowers, bees working in and out of them with a low, steady hum that was, this morning, the loudest sound in the whole garden. Susanna knelt among the bean rows and began to pick, her fingers finding the pods by feel almost as much as by sight, snapping them free with a small crisp sound and dropping them into her basket, and the smell of the vines rose up around her, green and slightly bitter, mixed with the warm, dry smell of the sun-baked earth, and underneath it always the sea's own smell drifting over the wall from beyond. A cabbage butterfly worked its way along the row ahead of her, indifferent to her presence, and somewhere behind her she could hear her mother's shears clicking as she cut a handful of the last chives before they went entirely to seed. "Your father says the inspector may come," Susanna said, not looking up from the beans. "He always says that in August," her mother answered, unbothered. "It's the month the tender favors when the water's easy. We'll be ready whenever he chooses to come. same as we're ready every day." Susanna smiled to herself at that, for it was true, and it was the plain confidence in her mother's voice, more than anything her father did with his lens and his logbook, that had taught her over the years not to fear the idea of a stranger's white glove finding fault with their house. There simply was no fault to find, not in a household run as steadily as this one, and the inspector, whenever he came, would climb his stairs and run his fingers along the sills and find them clean, and drink a cup of her mother's coffee, and go away again satisfied, as inspectors always did. They moved on from the beans to the hens, whose small fenced yard stood at the garden's far end, a dozen brown and speckled birds who set up their usual complaining fuss at the sight of the feed basket, crowding and pecking at Susanna's boots as she scattered the cracked corn in wide handfuls across the packed dirt. The smell here was sharper, ammoniac and warm, the smell of feathers and dust and the birds' own busy little lives, and Susanna gathered the morning's eggs from the nest boxes while the hens quarreled over the corn behind her. Warm, smooth ovals she laid carefully in her apron, 7 of them today, a good morning's laying. One hen, a fat speckled bird named, for no reason Susanna could now recall, Mrs. Pettibone, had gone broody again and sat glowering in her box, refusing to be moved, and Susanna left her to it, knowing from experience that Mrs. Pettibone's temper was not worth the trouble of arguing with over a single egg. By the time the beans were picked and the eggs gathered and the hens fed, the sun had climbed well clear of the horizon, and the whole station lay washed in the clean gold light of a summer morning, with nothing ahead of it but more of the same. And Susanna, straightening with her basket on her hip, looked out past the garden wall to where the sea still lay calm and silver blue all the way to the sky, and felt, as she often did at this hour, that she could not have asked the day for anything more than it had already, quietly, without being asked, decided to give her. The washing came next, for Monday was wash day at Cormorant Point, as it was wash day in every decent household up and down the coast, and Susanna and her mother spent the better part of the mid-morning bent over the great copper boiler set up in the yard behind the dwelling, where her father had built a small brick hearth for exactly this purpose, well clear of the house in case of scorching sparks. The water had to be carried first, bucket by bucket, from the cistern that caught the rain off the dwelling's roof, for the well water here ran faintly brackish and would not do for whites, and Susanna made the trip 6 times, her arms aching pleasantly by the 4th, while her mother fed the fire beneath the boiler and shaved soap into the heating water in thin curling ribbons. The smell of wash day was its own particular smell, lye soap and hot, wet cotton, and the sharp mineral tang of the boiling water itself, and it clung to Susanna's hands and apron all morning, no matter how she scrubbed. She fed the sheets and shirts into the roiling water, with the long wooden paddle worn smooth and gray from years of exactly this use, stirring and lifting and pressing them down again, watching the water go cloudy and gray-white with soap, steam rising off it in a column that the still morning air carried straight up without a breath of wind to bend it sideways. Her mother worked the smaller things by hand at the washboard set into its tub, George's stockings and Susanna's own underthings, scrubbing them against the ridged tin with a steady rhythmic sound, knuckles red from the work, humming under her breath some hymn tune Susanna half recognized but could not have named. They wrung the linens between them, twisting the heavy wet cloth in opposite directions until the water ran out of it in a thin, steady stream onto the packed dirt, and then carried the whole dripping mass to the clothesline strung between the corner of the dwelling and a post set for the purpose nearer the garden wall, where the sun and the light, steady air off the water would dry it faster than any fire could. Susanna pegged the sheets first, working her way along the line with the bag of wooden pins at her waist, and stood back a moment when she had finished to watch them hang, white and heavy and dead still in the windless morning, not so much as a corner stirring, the whole row of them like a fleet of becalmed sails waiting patiently for a wind that today would not trouble to come. She rather liked the stillness of it. On a blowing day the sheets would crack and snap and fight the line like living things, and half the pleasure of laundry was lost to the wrestling of it. But today they simply hung, warming slowly in the sun, and would be dry and sweet-smelling by early afternoon without either of them lifting another finger toward the task. While the wash dried, Susanna went back into the tower to see to the stairs and the lantern glass, chores that fell to her most days now that her father had grown too broad in the shoulder to comfortably manage the narrower turns near the top of the spiral without scraping his elbows raw. She swept first, working down from the watchroom with the short-handled broom kept specially for the iron treads, sending a fine dust of salt and dried mud and the tiny flecks of rust that no amount of paint could ever quite hold back down ahead of her in small drifting clouds that caught the light slanting in through the deep-set windows. The broom's bristles made a soft scraping whisper against the metal, turn after turn, and she counted the steps again as she went, from long habit, though she had no need of the number for anything but the small satisfaction of knowing it. The lantern glass wanted washing both inside and out, the great curved panes of the lantern room that let the light out into the night and let the wind and salt spray in against the glass by day, filming it over weeks with a fine gray haze that would, left uncleaned, have dimmed the beam by degrees too small to notice on any single evening, but large enough over a season of neglect to cost a passing vessel a mile or two of good, clear light. Susanna filled her bucket from the rain barrel at the tower's base and carried it up, along with her rags and the chamois and the little bottle of vinegar her mother swore by for glass, and set to work on the inside first, standing on the small step stool to reach the upper panes, wiping in long, even strokes so as not to leave streaks that would catch and scatter the lamplight unevenly come dark. Outside, on the gallery, the work was harder, for she had to reach out along the curve of the glass with one hand easy on the rail and the other working the rag. The whole wide sky and sea spread out beneath her, serene and unhurried, while gulls wheeled past close enough that she could hear the dry creak of their wings. She had been coming out onto this gallery since she was small, and the open air below had long since stopped being anything but a kind of vast, bright room she happened to be working at the edge of. The air out here smelled cleaner than anywhere else on the station, salt and cold stone, and a faint mineral sharpness that she associated with nowhere else on earth, and she paused, as she always did somewhere in the middle of this chore, to look out over the calm water and let the work rest a moment in her hands. Far off to the south, small as a toy, she could make out a coasting sloop working close along the shore, its single sail catching the light in a flash of white now and then as it came about, running some cargo of lumber or fish down toward the harbor town 2 points along the coast, and she watched it a moment with the mild, companionable interest she gave to every vessel that passed within sight of the tower, the way a farmer's daughter might watch a neighbor's wagon go by on the road. There was no drama in the watching, It was simply a pleasant thing to see, proof that the world beyond the point went on about its ordinary business, same as she did. By noon the glass shone, and the stairs lay clean and swept, and Susanna came down to find her mother had spread the midday meal on the kitchen table, cold ham from Sunday, and the last of the stewed apples, and a loaf her mother had baked fresh that morning, while the wash boiled, its crust still faintly warm when Susanna cut into it. Her father came in from the boathouse with the particular unhurried satisfaction of a man whose morning's work had gone exactly as it ought, and George trailed in behind him, smelling of low tide and pockets full of what Susanna strongly suspected were more crab shells. And the four of them sat together at the table with the window open to let in the mild air and the sound of the gulls, and ate without hurry, the way people eat who have no reason in all the wide world to be anywhere but exactly where they are. After the meal, while her mother and George saw to the dishes, Susanna took her mending basket out to the bench beside the kitchen door, where the sun fell warm and full, and a person might sit an hour without the day growing too hot to bear. There was always mending. A keeper's family went through stockings and shirt elbows and apron hems at a rate that never seemed to slacken, no matter how carefully things were worn. And Susanna had grown into a fair hand with a needle, closing the small tears and thin places with stitches so neat her mother had stopped inspecting her work years before. She worked steadily through George's stockings, then a shirt of her father's gone thin at the collar, the needle catching the sunlight in small silver flashes as it rose and fell, and the quiet of the early afternoon settled around her, broken only by the hen's occasional complaint from beyond the garden wall and the sea's own patient murmur, which she had stopped hearing as a separate sound long ago, the way a person stops hearing their own heartbeat, except that this heartbeat belonged to the whole wide world and not only to herself. When the mending basket was empty at last, she carried it back inside and found the afternoon had that loose, unclaimed feeling it sometimes had on a fair day when all the necessary work stood finished ahead of schedule. Her mother had gone to sit at the parlor window with her own work basket, and George had vanished somewhere down toward the boathouse to continue his long acquaintance with the tide pools. And so Susanna took down from the parlor shelf the wooden stereoscope her father had brought back from a trip to the mainland 3 winters before, along with its little box of paper cards, and carried it out to the bench to enjoy the last of the good light. She had looked through every card in that box more times than she could count, and still she liked the small, quiet magic of it, the way a flat gray photograph of some distant place, a cathedral in a city she would likely never see, or a waterfall tumbling white through mountains. Nothing like the low green hills behind the station sprang suddenly into a strange, convincing depth the moment she held the card up and looked through the 2 lenses together. She lingered longest, as she always did, over a card showing a wide city street lined with tall buildings and crowded with more people than she had ever seen gathered in one place in her life, and tried, as she always tried, to imagine the noise of it, the great confusion of voices and wheels and hooves on paving stones, and found, as she always found, that she could not quite do it, that the picture's silence was somehow truer to her than any noise she could invent to fill it. She was not sorry for that. She thought sometimes that a person who had grown up with the sea's steady voice in her ears from birth might not have much use for a city's clatter, even if she were dropped down in the middle of it. She set the stereoscope aside eventually and took up instead the letter that had come on the tender's last visit, near 3 weeks back now, from her cousin Alma in Portland, and read it through again, though she had it very nearly by heart. Alma's cramped, energetic hand describing a church supper and a new hat, and a young man named Frederick Alma, seemed unable to keep entirely out of any subject she wrote about, however far afield the subject began. Susanna meant to answer it that evening after supper, when the lamp was lit and there was time for sitting quiet with pen and paper, and she turned over in her mind pleasantly, without any hurry, what she might say about her own days, which held no young men and no new hats, but which she thought on the whole Alma might still enjoy hearing of, if only for their difference from her own. The afternoon wore on in this easy, unhurried fashion, the wash coming dry and stiff off the line by 3 o'clock, smelling of sun and salt, when Susanna gathered it into the basket and carried it in to be folded, the shadows in the yard swinging slowly round and lengthening as the sun crossed toward the west. Mr. Doyle, the assistant keeper, came by in the middle of the afternoon to consult her father about the state of the boathouse roof, a small patch of shingle gone soft that wanted mending before the autumn rains, and the two men stood a good while in the yard discussing it in the unhurried way of men with all the time in the world and no urgent reason to hurry a decision, while Susanna, folding sheets at the kitchen table within earshot of the open window, listened without quite meaning to, and thought that there was something pleasant in a problem so small and so entirely without stakes, a soft shingle and nothing more, no different in its way from a torn stocking or a hen gone broody. By 5, the light outside had begun to take on the particular deepening gold that told her, more surely than any clock, that the day was turning toward its evening work, and she felt the small, familiar lift in her chest that always came at this hour, the lift that had nothing to do with anything finishing and everything to do with the day's one true ceremony still lying ahead of her. Supper that evening was early and simple, as it always was on lighting nights. Fish her father had brought up from his own lines set that morning off the point, fried in cornmeal with new potatoes from the garden and the last of the beans Susanna had picked, and the family ate together at the kitchen table with the low sun coming gold and slanting through the west window, laying long bars of light across the scrubbed pine boards. George recounted with great feeling the full history of the day's crab, now apparently confirmed by close inspection to be an entirely new specimen with a philosophy all its own, and Susanna's mother asked her father whether Mr. Doyle meant to see to the shingle himself or send word to the mainland for a man to do it, and the ordinary threads of the day wove themselves together over the meal the way they did every evening, unremarkable and entirely dear. They did not linger long over supper, for the sun was already low, a great soft coin of orange gold sinking toward the water's rim, and the lighting of the lamp waited for no one's leisure. Susanna rose from the table almost before her mother had finished clearing the last plate, and climbed the tower stairs ahead of her father this time, eager for it in a way she was eager for nothing else in her whole long day, counting the turns without meaning to, 102, and came out into the watchroom breathless and glad just as the last full light of the sun came pouring gold and level through the western glazing. This was the hour Susanna loved best of anything the station gave her, better even than the gray hush of dawn, and she had never been able to say precisely why, except that it seemed to her the one moment in the whole turning day when the ordinary work of her hands touched something larger than itself, something almost sacred, though she would have blushed to use so grand a word aloud. Together, she and her father drew back the great linen curtains from the lens, hand over hand along the track, the heavy cloth sliding free to reveal the glass beneath, already catching fire with the low western light, every prism blazing gold and rose and deep amber, the whole great crystal beehive of it burning, as though it held some furnace of its own rather than merely a lamp not yet lit. Beyond the glazing, the sun sat huge and soft upon the very edge of the sea, and the water beneath it had turned to a long, unbroken sheet of hammered copper, calm still, not a ripple to break the light's reflection, so that for one long minute it seemed to Susanna that there were two suns, one sinking slowly into the sky's own rim and one sinking just as slowly into the sea's, and the tower stood exactly between them, exactly at the center of that vast, quiet symmetry. And she and her father stood inside the tower's glass crown like two small figures caught inside a jewel. Her father moved to the lamp and began his own quiet preparations, checking the wick one last time, the reservoir, the small mechanism that would draw oil steadily up through the night, and Susanna watched him with the old familiar tenderness she felt for him at this hour above all others, this tall gray-haired man, so plain and unremarkable in an ordinary room, transformed here in this high glass chamber at the day's turning into something she could only think to call a kind of priest, tending a flame that was not for himself, not even truly for his family, but for strangers he would never meet, sailing waters he could not see, who would look up from some dark deck miles off and find, in this small patient light, the one fixed point in all that shifting dark that told them plainly where the shore began. A lamp in a window, she thought, was all it truly was, only larger and set higher, and built to carry farther, so that no one on the water need feel of a clear, calm night like this one coming, that they traveled entirely alone. The sun touched the water's edge at last, and the last full blaze of daylight color drained slowly from the glass, gold giving way to rose, rose to a deep and darkening violet, and in that hush, in that precise turning moment between the day's light and the night's dark, her father struck the match. The small flame caught, no bigger than the last joint of a thumb, and rose steady and clear inside the lamp's glass chimney, and Susanna watched it seize the whole waiting apparatus of prisms around it and multiply itself 100 times over, gathering, bending, until the beam sprang outward through the western, glazing in one long, unbroken shaft of gold that seemed, for a moment, to reach clear to the darkening line where sky and sea had already begun to merge. Her father set the clockwork moving with a low, practiced motion of his hand, and the great lens began its slow, patient turn upon its bed of brass rollers, so smooth and so nearly silent that Susanna felt rather than heard the smallest whisper of its movement through the soles of her boots, and the beam began its long, unhurried sweep out over the water, flash and pause, the exact rhythm that told any vessel out there in the coming dark precisely which light it watched and precisely where it stood. They stepped out onto the gallery together to watch the last of the color go from the sky, and the air out there had turned cool and soft, carrying the evening's first hint of dew, mixed with wood smoke rising thin from the dwelling's chimney below, where her mother had banked the kitchen fire for the night's slow simmer of tomorrow's beans. Venus had come out low in the west, bright and steady above the place where the sun had gone down, and one by one the true stars followed it, pricking through a sky gone from violet to a deep clear indigo, cloudless still, the whole calm dome of it, without a single smear of weather anywhere to trouble it. Below them the beam swept past, over their heads and out across the water, and came round again, patient as breathing, and Susanna leaned her forearms on the cool iron rail and watched it go, feeling, as she felt every fair evening at this hour, that she had been given a very great privilege in being born to exactly this small gray tower on exactly this quiet point of land, though she could not have explained to anyone who had not stood here beside her precisely what the privilege consisted of. They went down together at last, leaving the light to its long, patient work, and the kitchen, when they reached it, was warm and gold lit by the lamp her mother had trimmed and set on the table, and the four of them sat a while in the soft glow of it, her father reading aloud a little from the newspaper the tender had left 3 weeks back, already old news but no less pleasant for it, and George nodding sleepily over a slate on which he was meant to be practicing his sums, and was in fact drawing with great concentration a crab. Susanna took out her pen and paper at last and began her letter to Alma, describing the wash on the line and the stereoscope city street and the fish fried in cornmeal, and found, as she always found, that the plain small facts of her day read back to her in her own hand as a kind of quiet contentment she did not think she could have manufactured out of anything grander. Later, when George had been sent up yawning to his bed and her mother sat mending by the lamp's steady light, her father rose to make his first climb of the night, back up the long spiral to check the lamp's burning and rewind the weight part way if it wanted it, and Susanna rose with him from old habit, though tonight he waved her back down with a small fond motion of his hand. "Sit," he said. "You've done a full day's work already, and the light doesn't need 2 of us to watch it burn on a night as calm as this one." She let him go alone, and sat instead in the kitchen's warm lamplight, finishing her letter, listening to his footsteps recede up through the covered way in the tower beyond, and thought of him standing up there now in the dark glass room, the beam sweeping steady over his head, the calm sea spread out silver black beneath a sky gone thick with stars, watching over the water the way he had watched over it every night of her life, and every night she supposed of his own life before that, since he had first come to this coast as a young man himself. She sealed her letter, banked the last of the kitchen fire under her mother's direction, and climbed at last to her own small room beneath the eaves, where the window stood open a crack to let in the cool night air, and with it the sea's own steady voice murmuring against the rocks the same unhurried murmur it had greeted her with at 4 that morning, patient and unbroken and entirely without weight. Far off, muffled by the thick walls and the intervening dark, she could just hear the faint rhythmic creak of the clockwork turning far above her in the tower, and somewhere beneath that, fainter still, she thought she could feel rather than hear the small steady beat of the beam itself, sweeping round and round over the calm water, minute after minute, hour after hour, needing nothing more from her now than her trust that it would go on doing exactly what it had always done. She undressed in the dark from long habit, folded her gray dress over the chair, and slid beneath the quilt her mother had pieced from flour sacking and worn calico, the corn husk ticking, rustling once beneath her, and then settling into stillness. Through the cracked window, the light swept past at its long, unhurried intervals, a soft gold wash across the ceiling, and gone again. Flash and pause, as familiar to her as her own pulse, and just as easy, now, to stop noticing at all. Her eyes grew heavy with the day's plain, honest weariness, the good tiredness of hands that had polished brass and pinned wet linen and turned soil and mended stockings and drawn heavy curtains against the sun, and beneath it all, steady as ever, the sea went on breathing against the rocks below the point, and the light went on turning above her, and Susanna, warm and sure and entirely at peace within the small gray walls of the only home she had ever known, let go of the day at last and slept.